Why did you join a cult? It all started when I turned down an internship at my uncle's company. You need to stop being so picky about opportunities, my mom said while I was trying to finish homework. I explained that the internship was unpaid and her brother's company was under investigation for fraud. You're always finding excuses instead of seeing possibilities, she said. She kept listing every opportunity I'd turned down in the past year, including the pyramid scheme my neighbor tried to recruit me for and that creepy photographer at the mall who wanted to make me a model. Your generation thinks everything should be perfect right away, she said. What if you tried just saying yes to everything? For the next week, she followed me around reading quotes about seizing opportunities and called my guidance counselor to complain that I was too selective. Fine. From now on, I'll say yes to every single opportunity that comes my way, I finally said, after she woke me up at 6 in the morning to discuss my lack of ambition. She actually hugged me and said this was the first mature decision I'd made in years. Monday started with a guy at the mall approaching me about joining his financial freedom program for $500 up front. Yes, I'm very interested, I said, while giving him mom's credit card, enjoying how her face went pale when she saw the charge. By Tuesday morning, he'd used that information to sign her up for 17 different recurring charges, and her book club friends found out when he started calling them using her contact list I'd provided. She had to explain why a 20-year-old was pitching them colon cleanses using her as a reference, and I watched her humiliation with cold satisfaction. Wednesday, our neighbor asked if I wanted to help with his illegal exotic animal rescue. Absolutely, I said, volunteering her as an emergency foster home just to see her come home to pythons in her bathtub and a capuchin monkey destroying her grandmother's china. Thursday's opportunity was my friend's brother wanting to throw a music festival in our backyard, and by Friday, she had 400 calls about Karen's Kool-Aid acid test, plus a visit from the police. Each disaster made me feel powerful for once, watching her deal with the consequences of her own advice. Saturday morning, she was begging me to stop when the substitute teacher arrived to discuss her brother Phoenix's transformational leadership program in Oregon. I agreed to visit immediately, and she spent the 2-hour drive crying while I felt nothing but grim satisfaction. Phoenix met us at the gate wearing all white, but something shifted when he looked at me, really looked at me, and said I had exceptional energy he'd rarely seen in someone so young. Your son has been dimming his light to make others comfortable, Phoenix told my mom while maintaining eye contact with me, and suddenly my throat felt tight because no one had ever suggested I was anything but a disappointment. He showed us photos of people working in gardens and explained how they'd found purpose through surrendering their need for external validation. Jackson has spent his whole life trying to meet impossible standards set by people who don't understand his true nature, he said, and my mom protested, but I was frozen because how did he know that exact feeling? When he explained the 6-month isolation period, I started to tell my mom this was what she'd asked for, but Phoenix put his hand on my shoulder and said something that made me forget my spite entirely. You don't have to perform for anyone here, Jackson, because we already see your worth without you having to prove anything. My eyes burned because I couldn't remember anyone ever saying I was enough just as I was, and suddenly, the compound didn't seem like revenge, but like escape from the constant weight of never measuring up. My mom was grabbing my arm and crying about cults and brainwashing, but Phoenix kept talking about how some people were meant for extraordinary paths that their families couldn't understand. Your mother loves you, but she's been trying to force you into a shape that was never yours, he said gently, and I felt something crack open in my chest because it was the first time anyone had acknowledged both things could be true. He pulled out paperwork and explained how members found peace by releasing their toxic need for approval, and I realized I wasn't pretending anymore because I wanted what he was describing more than I'd ever wanted anything. This isn't real, my mom sobbed, but Phoenix smiled at me with an understanding that made my chest ache with wanting to be seen, and suddenly I understood why people joined cults, because this feeling of being chosen and valuable was intoxicating after 18 years of being wrong. Jackson understands that comfort is the enemy of growth, he said, and I realized he was the first person who'd ever suggested I was understanding anything at all. I looked at my mom and said, "You told me to say yes to everything, and this is the first thing that's ever felt like a real yes." Her face crumpled as she saw I meant it, that her constant criticism had left me desperate enough to believe the first stranger who said I was special, and Phoenix was already guiding me toward the compound gate. His hand stayed on my shoulder as we walked through the tall wooden gates, and suddenly I was inside, actually inside, with about 20 people in white clothes turning to look at us with these huge smiles that made my stomach flip between excited and scared. Phoenix raised his voice to tell everyone I'd chosen to join their family of seekers, and they all started clapping and coming forward to hug me, while Mom stood frozen outside the gates behind us, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't find words. The warmth of all these strangers touching me and saying welcome felt so different from the cold distance I was used to at home, and for a second, I actually forgot this whole thing started as revenge against her. Phoenix led me deeper into the compound past gardens, where people were working with dirt under their fingernails, and past a big white building that looked like it used to be a barn, then up some stairs to a small room with just a twin bed, a wooden dresser, and one window looking out at trees. He explained that keeping things simple helped us focus on what really mattered, which was inner growth instead of material distractions. And even though the room was basically empty, except for that bed and dresser, when he said I was exceptional for recognizing truth so quickly, I felt that same warm glow spreading through my chest. Mom had followed us into the building and was trying to push past Phoenix to get to me, but he turned and gently blocked her path, explaining in this calm voice that family visits during the initial adjustment period would only disrupt the important work I needed to do. She started begging me to reconsider, grabbing at my arm and crying about how this wasn't what she meant. But I looked her straight in the eye and told her this was exactly what saying yes to everything looked like, using her own advice as a weapon while Phoenix nodded like I was the smartest person he'd ever met. He pulled out this thick packet of papers from a folder and started explaining how the 6-month isolation period was essential for breaking the toxic patterns that had been programmed into us by society and family, and even though the rules looked pretty strict when I glanced at them, stuff about no outside contact and surrendering personal property and mandatory participation in all activities, the way he framed each one as protection from the corrupt outside world made them sound reasonable. I signed my name at the bottom without really reading the whole thing, because questioning him now would feel like betraying these people who were literally applauding my existence. Mom was still in the hallway crying and saying she wouldn't leave without me, so Phoenix suggested in this understanding voice that maybe I should stay overnight to avoid another confrontation that would just upset everyone, explaining that sometimes the most loving thing we could do was create space for people to process their emotions. Going home felt impossible anyway after everything I'd said and done, so I nodded and watched Mom's face crumple even more when she realized I was actually choosing to stay. Phoenix held out his hand and asked for my phone, explaining that constant connectivity to the outside world prevented us from doing the deep inner work necessary for transformation. And even though my stomach clenched at the thought of being without it, I handed it over feeling both anxious and weirdly relieved to disconnect from the 400 messages about the festival disaster. He put the phone in a drawer and locked it with a small key that he slipped into his pocket, then showed me where the shared bathroom was down the hall, and gave me some white clothes to change into that looked exactly like what everyone else was wearing. That night I barely slept on the thin mattress, listening to footsteps in the hallway, and muffled voices from other rooms, wondering what I'd gotten myself into, but also feeling this strange excitement about finally doing something that wasn't planned or approved or criticized by my mom. The next morning, someone knocked on my door at 5:30 and led me to a big room where about 15 people were sitting in a circle on cushions. And when Phoenix introduced me as their newest family member who'd had the courage to leave toxic dynamics behind, everyone started sharing these supportive comments about how brave I was and how they could already see my potential for growth. They went around the circle taking turns affirming my decision, saying things about how most people never had the strength to break free from family programming. And when they all applauded again, I felt my eyes getting wet because I couldn't remember the last time anyone had celebrated me just for existing. Seems like Jackson's little revenge plan is taking on a life of its own here, starting with credit card fraud and ending with him signing mystery papers while crying. After the circle, Phoenix presented me with what he called a values covenant. This document full of vague language about contributing to community sustainability and releasing attachments to the material world and committing to radical honesty within the sacred container of our family. I signed it immediately because questioning anything would feel like betraying the first people who'd ever made me feel special, even though some part of me noticed the language was confusing enough that it could mean almost anything. Phoenix announced my commitment to the group, and they all stood up to hug me again, their bodies warm and their smiles so genuine that I pushed down the tiny voice wondering what exactly I'd just agreed to. That evening after dinner, which was just rice and vegetables that we ate in silence, Phoenix pulled me aside for what he called a one-on-one breakthrough session in his office, which had much nicer furniture than the rest of the compound and certificates on the walls from programs I'd never heard of. He sat across from me and started repeating back the exact words I'd used earlier about feeling unseen and misunderstood, saying he recognized my light immediately because he'd once felt that same dimming when people tried to force him into boxes that weren't meant for him. The way he looked at me while talking, really looked at me like he could see straight through to my soul, made me trust him completely, even though we'd known each other less than 2 days. On the third day, I woke up to voices in the parking lot and looked out my window to see 2 staff members talking to my mom next to her car, their body language polite but firm as they gestured toward the road. They were explaining something about respecting my journey toward independence and how her presence was preventing me from fully committing to my growth. And even though I couldn't hear all the words, I could see her shoulders shaking as she cried. She kept pointing at the building and shaking her head, but eventually she got in her car and started driving slowly toward the gate, looking back every few seconds like maybe I'd come running out. I watched her car get smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely down the dirt road, and the guilty relief I felt at not having to see her crumpled face anymore, mixed with this sudden panic about being truly alone for the first time in my life. The next morning, someone knocked on my door at 4:30 and handed me work clothes that smelled like dirt and sweat from whoever wore them before. I followed the others to the garden where we pulled weeds in the dark until the sun came up, my back aching after just an hour while everyone else worked silently around me. At noon, we moved to the kitchen where I peeled potatoes until my fingers went numb, then scrubbed pots with water so hot it turned my hands red and raw. Evening meant cleaning bathrooms and hauling trash to the dumpster behind the main building. 14 hours of work that left me too tired to even think about home. The routine continued every day that week with garden duty at dawn, kitchen prep at noon, and maintenance tasks until 9 at night when we finally got to collapse into our beds. My hands blistered from the shovel handle and my legs shook from exhaustion, but everyone kept saying how well I was adjusting to the sacred rhythm of service. Phoenix would walk through sometimes and nod at me with this proud smile that made the pain worth it because finally someone thought I was doing something right. On Saturday, the substitute teacher who'd brought us here showed up during lunch and pulled me aside to say Phoenix rarely accepted new members so quickly. She told me he'd been talking about my exceptional energy all week and how I was already integrating better than people who'd been there months. The praise made me glow even though I could barely stay awake and my whole body hurt from the constant work. That night, while scrubbing dishes alone in the kitchen, I started composing letters to Mom in my head, explaining how her years of criticism had made me desperate for anyone's approval. The words felt true, but also cruel, so I never wrote them down, just kept replaying them while my hands moved automatically through the soapy water. I'd tell her about the time she made me rewrite my college essay 17 times because it was never good enough, or how she told my girlfriend I wasn't ambitious enough for her daughter. Part of me wanted her to know exactly how much damage she'd done, but another part just felt tired and sad about everything. During the second week, Phoenix called me into his office and mentioned that deeper transformation required a donation to maintain our sacred space. He said $5,000 would unlock advanced workshops that could accelerate my growth beyond what most members achieved in years. The amount made my stomach drop, but I remembered Mom's emergency credit card in my wallet and told myself that doubting was just my ego resisting change. I handed over the card, and Phoenix smiled like I'd passed some important test, saying my commitment to growth was remarkable for someone so young. That same week, they changed our sleep schedule to 5 hours a night with Phoenix, explaining that exhaustion helped break down the ego's defenses. We'd go to bed at 11 and wake up at 4, stumbling through our work assignments, dizzy and confused, while everyone praised our dedication to the process. I started seeing things in my peripheral vision and forgetting what task I was doing halfway through, but Phoenix said this was normal during rapid transformation. By week 3, they gathered us for something called a confession circle, where we had to share our deepest resentments about our families. When my turn came, I spent 20 minutes listing every criticism Mom had ever made, from telling me I walked wrong to saying my laugh was annoying. The group nodded and validated my pain, while Phoenix watched with this knowing expression, like he'd expected exactly this. I felt completely exposed, but also understood for the first time, like these strangers saw the real damage behind my fake revenge story. The next day, I watched a woman get torn apart in front of everyone for calling her sister without permission. Phoenix accused her of choosing comfort over growth and made her stand in the center while everyone told her how disappointed they were in her weakness. She sobbed and apologized over and over while my stomach twisted because I knew that could be me if I made one wrong move. Later, Phoenix pulled me aside and said my revenge schemes against Mom weren't petty cruelty, but brave acts of self-liberation. He explained that most people never had the courage to make their families face consequences for their toxic behavior, but I'd shown exceptional strength. The way he reframed everything made me feel proud instead of guilty, like maybe I'd been right all along to fight back. They assigned me a growth partner named Yasmin Coates, who was supposed to help me process my transformation, but I noticed she took notes after every conversation. She seemed nice enough, but there was something careful about how she asked questions, always writing in this little notebook she kept in her pocket. I started watching what I said around her, giving the answers I thought Phoenix would want to hear instead of what I actually felt. During week 5, Phoenix asked me to record my transformation testimony on video for future recruits who might relate to my story. He set up a camera in his office and had me talk for over an hour about Mom's failures as a parent and how the compound had saved me from her toxicity. I heard myself saying things I wasn't sure I believed anymore, but the camera was rolling and Phoenix kept nodding encouragingly, so I kept going. When I finished, he said my story of escaping maternal oppression would inspire countless others to break free from their own toxic families. The woman at the front desk caught me on my way to morning circle and mentioned Mom had been calling non-stop for the past 3 days. She said Phoenix instructed them to screen all outside contact as potentially triggering during this delicate phase of transformation. Part of me wanted to grab the phone and hear what Mom was saying, but Phoenix appeared behind me and explained that curiosity about our toxic past only blocks future growth. He guided me away from the desk while the woman deleted the voicemail notifications without playing them. After 6 weeks of perfect attendance and participation, Phoenix called me into his office to discuss my exceptional progress. He handed me an extra cup of coffee and said I'd earned a second helping at dinner tonight as reward for my dedication. The coffee tasted incredible after weeks of herbal tea, and the promise of more food made my stomach growl with anticipation. These tiny privileges felt massive after the strict rationing we'd all been following for cellular purification. That evening, I ate my extra portion slowly, while other members watched with obvious envy, and I understood how these small rewards kept us all competing for Phoenix's approval. The monthly community sustenance invoice arrived in my assigned mailbox, showing charges for 12 different workshops I couldn't remember attending. When I brought the paper to Phoenix's office, he smiled and explained that unconscious participation actually goes deeper than conscious attendance. He said my higher self had been absorbing the teachings while my ego mind rested, which is why the fees were even more valuable than regular workshops. I nodded like this made perfect sense and signed the authorization for another $3,000 from Mom's emergency fund. The next morning, I saw a woman I'd worked with in the garden quietly packing her things while Bennett Cloud stood in her doorway watching. She kept her eyes down and moved quickly, shoving clothes into a worn backpack without folding them. Why does Phoenix wait exactly 6 weeks before offering that extra food reward? The timing feels calculated somehow, like he knows precisely when people start breaking down from exhaustion and hunger. Nobody mentioned her at breakfast, and when I asked Yasmin what happened, she just shook her head and changed the subject. Later, Phoenix gathered us for an impromptu meeting about commitment and mentioned that some people choose the comfort of their old patterns over real transformation. He never said her name, but we all understood that leaving meant failing, meant being too weak for the journey we'd started. Phoenix found me after dinner and asked me to walk with him through the meditation garden to discuss something important. He said he'd been observing my exceptional energy and natural leadership abilities that most members take years to develop. My exhaustion from the day's work vanished as he explained that he wanted to invite me to an exclusive inner circle workshop. Only the most promising students ever received this invitation, and he'd never offered it to someone so new to the community. The workshop would unlock advanced teachings that regular members never accessed, putting me on track to become a future leader myself. The inner circle workshop required a $10,000 sacred tithe to maintain the purity of the teachings. Phoenix handed me a stack of NDAs, explaining that these advanced methods were proprietary and sharing them would damage the spiritual development of unprepared minds. I signed every page without reading the dense legal text and maxed out Mom's final credit card for the privilege. Phoenix hugged me and said my complete trust showed readiness for the deepest levels of transformation. Week 9 brought a new schedule that started with intense exercise at 4 in the morning, followed by garden work on only vegetable broth. Phoenix called it cellular reset protocol, explaining that physical depletion allows spiritual energy to flow more freely. I stumbled through the days lightheaded and seeing spots, but interpreted the dizziness as my consciousness expanding beyond physical limitations. Other members praised my dedication when I nearly fainted during kitchen duty, saying they could see my aura brightening with each day of the protocol. Yasmin and I were pulling weeds in the far corner of the garden where no cameras reached when she asked quietly if I ever missed home. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she kept working without looking at me, waiting for an answer. I gave the approved response about choosing growth over comfort and leaving toxic patterns behind for good. She smiled sadly and said she understood, but something in her eyes suggested she was really asking something else entirely. A certified letter arrived the next week from a law firm representing my mother with warnings about cult indoctrination tactics. The envelope also contained documentation about coercive control and demands for immediate welfare checks to confirm my safety. Phoenix read the entire letter aloud during morning circle, using a mocking voice for the legal language while everyone laughed. He held up the pages about mind control techniques and said this showed how threatened the outside world was by our evolution. When he got to the part about Mom hiring deprogramming specialists, people actually applauded his dramatic reading. Phoenix crumpled the letter and tossed it in the ceremonial fire pit, explaining that the universe always tests our commitment through family resistance. He said truly exceptional people throughout history faced opposition from those threatened by their growth and transformation. The fact that Mom had involved lawyers and specialists just proved how powerful my journey had become. He put his hand on my shoulder and told everyone that my strength in facing this resistance would inspire future generations of seekers. Week 11 brought Phoenix to my room with a thick stack of papers about investing in the compound's new organic farm that would supposedly triple everyone's money within 6 months. He sat on my bed explaining how this opportunity was only for the most trusted members while I filled out the credit application, and when he asked for Mom's social security number for the background check, I recited it from memory without hesitation. The next morning, I was carrying breakfast trays to the administrative office when I saw Phoenix's desk covered with receipts and bank statements, and one ledger showed my $10,000 donation listed as vehicle maintenance next to a Mercedes dealership invoice. My stomach twisted disgusted seeing designer clothing receipts labeled as spiritual materials and restaurant charges coded as community nutrition, but I pushed down the anger by reminding myself that leaders needed resources to guide others effectively. During afternoon meditation, Phoenix moved behind me and placed both hands on my shoulders, leaning close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne as he whispered that I was his most promising student in years. The pride and discomfort tangled together in my chest as his fingers pressed into my shoulders, and I couldn't tell if the special attention made me feel chosen or trapped. 3 days later, the substitute teacher who'd first brought me here appeared at dinner, explaining she'd come to check on my progress and warn about outside interference. She pulled me aside after the meal and mentioned Mom had been calling former members and spreading lies about the program, which could be considered harassment with serious legal consequences. "Your mother is trying to sabotage your growth," she said, while showing me screenshots of Mom's Facebook posts asking for help, and I felt embarrassed that she was making our private situation so public. The next morning, during our 5 a.m. exercise routine, a woman named Claire suddenly dropped to the ground, clutching her chest and gasping for air. Phoenix barely glanced at her before announcing she was having a dramatic reaction to releasing old trauma, and we all kept doing jumping jacks while 2 members carried her to the meditation room. Nobody mentioned Claire at lunch or dinner, and when I asked Yasmin about her during dish duty, she just shrugged and said, "People process healing differently." That weekend, Phoenix assigned me to orientation duty with a nervous 19-year-old girl whose parents had driven her up from California. I sat with her in the welcome center, repeating Phoenix's exact words about toxic families and finding your true purpose, feeling hollow as she nodded eagerly and signed the same papers I'd signed. "This place saved my life," I heard myself saying, even though the words tasted wrong, and she smiled with the same desperate hope I'd felt 11 weeks ago. Monday morning brought whispers through the compound that Mom had hired some professional named Jolene Corbett, who specialized in getting people out of places like this. Phoenix called an emergency meeting in the main hall, where he paced back and forth explaining how these so-called exit counselors were actually predators who destroyed sacred communities for profit. "They use manipulation tactics to confuse your clarity," he said, while everyone murmured agreement, and I wondered if that was different from what we did here. He showed us articles about deprogrammers kidnapping people and forcing them to renounce their beliefs, making it sound like Jolene was more dangerous than anything we'd experienced at the compound. The loyalty ritual came 2 nights later, with all 40 members gathered in a circle holding candles, while Phoenix stood in the center with a microphone. When my turn came, he asked me to publicly declare my commitment by renouncing my birth family and accepting the compound as my only true home. My voice shook as I repeated the words about rejecting the toxic bonds of blood for the pure connections of chosen family, knowing Mom would be destroyed if she ever heard this. Everyone applauded when I finished, but my throat felt raw from saying things that felt like betrayal, even if they were supposed to be liberation. The next morning, Phoenix presented me with another financial document for a leadership training investment of $15,000. I hesitated before signing, something about the amount making me pause, and Phoenix's face darkened as he assigned me to septic tank duty for the next week as a lesson in humility. The punishment work involved pumping waste in 90-degree heat while wearing a plastic suit that made me dizzy, and I spent hours in the stench wondering why spiritual growth required literal shit work. My anger grew with each day of punishment, especially when I saw newer members doing garden work while I hauled sewage, and I started questioning if this was really about growth or just control. Friday afternoon, Yasmin found me behind the tool shed where we couldn't be seen and pulled out a manila folder she'd hidden under her shirt. "I need to show you something," she whispered, while opening it to reveal dozens of printed testimonies including mine, but the words had been cut and rearranged to sound worse than what we'd actually said. My testimony about Mom's criticism had been edited to include accusations of abuse I'd never made, with spliced sentences creating completely false stories about neglect and violence. Yasmin's own testimony had been altered to claim her parents had stolen money from her when really she'd given it to Phoenix, and she showed me how everyone's confessions had been weaponized into blackmail material. "I want to leave, but they'll send these to everyone I know," she said with tears in her eyes, and I realized we were all trapped by our own twisted words. The folder had dozens of pages, and I kept flipping through them, finding more lies, until I reached my own testimony, where Mom's normal nagging had been cut and pasted into stories about physical abuse that never happened. The words were mine, but rearranged, so "she pushed me to succeed" became "she pushed me down the stairs," and constant criticism turned into constant beatings, with every sentence twisted into something worse. The way Phoenix handles that legal letter from Jackson's mom tells me everything about how this place really works, turning serious warnings into entertainment while everyone claps. That folder Yasmin showed with all those cut-up testimonies makes me wonder how long Phoenix has been collecting blackmail material on everyone here. My hands shook as I read accusations about Mom locking me in closets and denying me food, when really she'd just grounded me or made me eat vegetables like any normal parent. Yasmin pointed to timestamps timestamps showing the edits happened after we recorded them, and explained how Phoenix used software to splice our words into whatever story he needed for control. The rage hit me so hard I couldn't breathe, because this wasn't just about keeping us here, but destroying our families if we ever tried to leave. I stormed across the compound to Phoenix's office, where he sat editing another video, and slammed the papers on his desk, demanding to know why he was making us into liars. He didn't even look surprised, just smiled and said, "The editing revealed what we really meant underneath our defensive language about our toxic families. Your conscious mind protects your abusers, but these edits show your unconscious truth," he explained while pulling up my original testimony and showing how he'd isolated specific words. He claimed every edit came from my own voice, just rearranged to bypass my programmed loyalty to someone who'd hurt me for 18 years. The explanation made me dizzy, because part of me wondered if maybe he was right about Mom being worse than I admitted, but then I remembered she'd never hit me once. Phoenix kept talking about how victims often minimize abuse and need help seeing the full truth of their trauma, while I stared at the screen, watching him demonstrate the editing software. He showed me how easy it was to move words around and create any story from raw footage, and seemed proud of his technical skills. Later that afternoon, I found Yasmin in the garden, where the big oak tree blocked the security cameras, and whispered that I needed Jolene Corbett's number immediately. She looked around nervously, then pulled a tiny piece of paper from her pocket with 10 digits written in pencil and pressed it into my palm. "Be careful, because Phoenix has people watching the phones," she warned, before walking away quickly toward the tool shed. I memorized the number, then ate the paper because I'd seen another member get caught with contraband and didn't want to risk punishment. 3 days passed before anything happened. Then I heard sirens approaching the compound and saw 2 police cars pull up to the main gate. Bennett Cloud rushed out to meet them, while Phoenix gathered everyone in the meeting hall and told us to stay calm and let leadership handle the situation. Through the window, I watched Bennett talking to the officers and showing them paperwork while gesturing toward the buildings like he was giving a tour. Phoenix explained that sometimes concerned families sent police for welfare checks, but we were all adults making our own choices about spiritual growth. The officers stayed for 20 minutes walking around the property with Bennett, who kept them away from the dormitories where we were hiding. I wanted to run outside and tell them everything, but Phoenix had positioned senior members by every door, and my legs felt frozen with fear. The police finally left after Bennett showed them some kind of legal documents, and Phoenix praised us for maintaining our spiritual composure during the test. A week later, Phoenix announced that Jolene Corbett had requested a meeting with me at a coffee shop in town with lawyers present to ensure everyone's safety. He acted like this was great news and said it showed how reasonable and transparent our community was compared to other groups. The meeting would happen in 3 days with Bennett as my support person and specific rules about what topics could be discussed. Phoenix gave me a script to memorize about how happy I was and how my family just didn't understand my spiritual journey. The night before the meeting, Phoenix called me to his office and said there'd been a change of plans because off-site meetings could be traumatic. Instead, he offered me something better, which was a permanent staff position helping run the compound's educational programs for new members. The promotion meant signing a 5-year commitment contract and legally changing my name to show my complete transformation and dedication. He explained this was the highest honor for someone so young and proved I was ready to help others find the same peace I'd discovered here. The contract included cutting all ties with my birth family permanently and transferring any inheritance rights to the compound for distribution to worthy causes. When I hesitated, he reminded me that Jolene was a professional manipulator hired by my mother to destroy everything I'd built here. The next morning, I went to the administration building to sign some routine paperwork, but found a credit report Phoenix had left on his desk with my name on it. 3 credit cards I'd never applied for showed balances of $14,000, $12,000, and $14,000, all maxed out with cash advances. The purchases were all from the last 2 months, including Phoenix's car payment, designer clothes, and restaurant bills at places I'd never been. My whole body went cold, realizing I'd be paying this off for decades, and Phoenix had destroyed my credit before I'd even started adult life. That afternoon, during kitchen duty, Yasmin slipped behind me while I was washing dishes and pressed something into my apron pocket. It was a cheap flip phone with a single number already programmed, and she whispered that 5 other members wanted out but needed someone brave enough to make the first call. She said they'd all contributed money to buy the phone and hidden it for weeks, waiting for the right person to use it. At 2 in the morning, I locked myself in the bathroom stall furthest from any cameras and dialed the number with shaking fingers. Jolene answered immediately like she'd been waiting, and I whispered my location and that Phoenix had been making threats about the edited videos. She explained she could have legal support and extraction ready within hours, but I needed to clearly state that I wanted to leave the compound voluntarily. I said yes, I wanted to leave, and she told me to destroy the phone and act normal until she could coordinate with law enforcement for a safe extraction. The next morning, Phoenix appeared at my door with Bennett and a laptop showing security footage of me in the bathroom stall, clearly making a phone call. He also had the edited clips of of my testimony playing on repeat, showing all the horrible things about Mom that I'd never actually said. Your mother's employer would be very interested in knowing what kind of person raised you, he said, while Bennett stood blocking the doorway with his arms crossed. I stared at the laptop screen showing my edited testimony, while Phoenix explained how disappointed he was in my betrayal. He said Jolene was a professional manipulator who'd convinced me to throw away my transformation for Mom's toxic comfort. Bennett shifted his weight in the doorway as Phoenix played another clip where my spliced words made Mom sound like she'd abused me for years. The next morning, Jolene somehow arranged a meeting at a coffee shop downtown, despite Phoenix's objections, and Bennett drove me there in silence while I watched the familiar streets pass by. The coffee shop was crowded with normal people living normal lives, and I spotted Mom at a corner table with Jolene and a woman in a suit who turned out to be a lawyer. Bennett sat at the next table watching everything while I slid into the booth across from Mom, my hands shaking under the table. Jolene explained calmly that Phoenix's threats to release the edited videos constituted extortion under state law, loud enough for Bennett to hear clearly. The lawyer added that using fraudulent credit applications in my name was identity theft with serious federal penalties, and I saw Bennett pull out his phone to text someone. Mom looked different somehow, calmer maybe, and when she spoke, she didn't beg or cry or list all the ways I'd hurt her. She said she loved me and was sorry for years of criticism that made me feel like nothing was ever good enough. She didn't demand I forgive her or come home immediately, just said she'd be there whenever I was ready to talk. Something cracked in my chest, hearing her take responsibility without making it about her pain, and I had to look away. Phoenix called my phone 17 times during that hour, but I didn't answer, and Jolene explained I had the legal right to leave whenever I wanted. When we got back to the compound, Phoenix was waiting with a new offer, saying he'd been testing me, and I'd passed by showing such loyalty. He wanted to make me his successor, train me to run my own program, finally be the leader I was meant to be. The temptation hit hard, because after 18 years of being nobody, the chance to be important felt like everything I'd wanted. But then I remembered Yasmin's face when she showed me those edited videos, and the member who collapsed during exercise, and all the credit cards in my name. I told Phoenix no, I was leaving, and his whole manner changed as he started listing every debt I owed, every contract I'd signed, every video he had. Jolene's lawyer called him directly on speaker and calmly explained the criminal penalties for fraud, extortion, and identity theft if he pursued any of those threats. She mentioned that 5 other members had already contacted her about similar financial crimes, and the state attorney was very interested. Phoenix's face went pale, and he suddenly became very reasonable, saying of course I was free to leave if that's what I truly wanted. The next morning, 2 police officers arrived to supervise my departure, not arresting anyone, but making it clear they were documenting everything. I packed my few belongings while other members watched from doorways and windows, some looking jealous, others disappointed, a few giving small nods of encouragement. Yasmin passed me in the hallway and squeezed my hand quickly, whispering that 3 others were calling Jolene that week. Phoenix keeping that credit report right on his desk where Jackson could see it makes me wonder if he wanted it found. Nobody's that careless with evidence of identity theft unless they're trying to send a message about their power over someone. Phoenix stood at the gate in his white clothes trying to look spiritual and unbothered, but I saw his jaw clenching as Mom's car pulled up. The drive home was quiet, except for Mom saying we could take things as slow as I needed, and I stared out the window feeling empty and strange. The first week back was hell with panic attacks every morning when I woke up expecting work assignments and sharing circles. Credit card companies called constantly about the $40,000 in debt Phoenix had accumulated, and Mom helped me file fraud reports without mentioning how much it would cost to fight. She found a therapist named Gabriel Cornell who specialized in cult recovery, and I sat in his office that first session, unable to speak for 20 minutes. He didn't push, just sat there until I finally started talking about feeling worthless and special at the same time, how Phoenix made me feel seen while stealing my future. The panic attacks got worse before they got better, hitting me in grocery stores when too many choices made me dizzy, or when Mom asked simple questions that felt like tests. Gabriel taught me breathing exercises and helped me understand that the fog in my brain was normal after months of sleep deprivation and manipulation. Mom and I started having sessions together where Gabriel helped us practice new ways of talking, her expressing concern without criticism, me being honest without cruelty. We made lists of trigger words and phrases, finding ways to communicate that didn't send us back to our old patterns. Slowly, painfully, we started building something different from what we'd had before. Not perfect, but more honest. 3 months in, I got a job at a hardware store, nothing special but mine, earned without Phoenix's approval or Mom's criticism. 6 months after leaving, I was making payments on a negotiated settlement for the credit cards, seeing Gabriel every week, and learning to trust my own thoughts again. Mom and I had dinner once a week with clear boundaries about what we could discuss, both of us trying to be different from before. Phoenix's compound got investigated after more members left and contacted authorities, but he just relocated to Arizona and started over with a new name for his program, because guys like him always find find new people desperate to feel special. All right, that's a wrap for today. Thanks for letting me wonder about things with you. It's been quite a ride. Until we meet again, stay curious. And if you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.